Hello everyone, this is Professor Wall again, and we are going to talk about the chemistry of life. This is lecture 2. We'll do this in a couple of parts, and this will correspond to chapter 2 of the textbook. In this lecture, a couple of major topics we're going to cover. We're going to discuss atoms and elements, molecules and their chemical bonds, things like water, the pH scale, and inorganic compounds, as well as some important organic compounds, including carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, and ATP. Just to remind you of where we are in our levels of organization, we talked about the body having several levels of organization. This chapter will deal with the smallest level of organization, the chemical level. And what we see in this chart of the levels of organization here, we're going to start with individual atoms. We'll build those up into molecules, and we'll build the molecules up into larger molecules such as DNA or proteins, and these will be the building blocks for making organelles and cells in the next chapter. Let's define chemistry as the scientific study of matter and the interaction of matter. Matter will be anything that has mass and occupies space. The human body is made out of various chemicals, and our physiology results from tens of thousands or possibly even millions of different chemical reactions. The sum of all the chemical reactions occurring either in a cell or in the whole organism will be called the metabolism. We're going to start with atoms and elements. All matter is made of atoms. There are 92 naturally occurring elements on Earth. These are things like carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. An element cannot be broken down into any other substance by ordinary chemical means or ordinary chemical reactions. And we'll define an atom as the smallest piece of an element which retains the chemical properties of that element. We list the elements in what's called the periodic table, and you'll find one of these also in your textbook. This is a list of the elements, their chemical symbols or abbreviations, and a little information about their masses and their numbers of subatomic particles. We don't need to know all 92 of the naturally occurring elements, though. Only a few of these are involved in the chemistry of living organisms. And we can see on the left-hand side of this chart the organisms which account for most of the body weight in a human body, things like oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus. What you may not see on this list is water, and you perhaps are thinking, I thought the body was mostly water. And you are correct. The body is mostly water by weight. However, water is not a single element. Water is a compound of two elements, oxygen and hydrogen. Over here on the right-hand side, we see some of the lesser elements, the micronutrients, or mineral nutrients, things like sulfur, potassium, sodium. All of these are less than 1% of total body weight. We'll draw the structure of an individual atom. And when we draw atoms like this, we're drawing them kind of like little solar systems, and they're composed of subatomic particles. Protons, neutrons, and electrons. The protons are shown as red in these drawings. This little red circle in the middle is a proton. Here's an atomic nucleus with some protons in red and some neutrons in gray. The electrons are drawn as kind of like the planets orbiting around the atomic nucleus. They're shown here in the rings. Atoms from different elements will have different numbers of protons and neutrons. They will have different atomic masses, and they will have different chemical properties as a result of having different numbers and arrangements of protons and electrons. When we draw atomic structures like this, it's important to remember that atoms are really, really small. They're far too small to see as individual objects, even with our most powerful microscopes. So we don't really know what they look like. They don't look like anything because they're so small, but we draw them like this because we're trying to keep track of the protons, neutrons, and electrons. And here we see different ways of drawing a hydrogen atom with its 1 proton and 1 electron, and a carbon atom with 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons. We could also draw these with the electrons as a fuzzy yellow cloud, kind of whizzing around the outer layers or the outer shells of the atomic structure. When we put 2 or more atoms together, we form a molecule, and they'll be joined by a chemical bond called a covalent bond. And if we have 2 different atoms in the structure, we'll call that a compound, 2 or more different elements in the compound. Examples of molecules would be things like oxygen and water. Water also counts as a compound because there's 2 different elements in there, oxygen and hydrogen. And salt, sodium chloride, is also counts as a compound. We'll talk more about the different types of atomic bonds in a moment. Chemical formulas will describe or express the chemical composition of the molecule or the compound. H2O is the simple chemical formula for water. It tells you that there's 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen in a water molecule. In these drawings, we're looking at the three different ways of drawing a water molecule. So here we have 2 hydrogens and oxygen separate. Those are going to join together to form an individual water molecule. We've drawn it as kind of a 3D structure, maybe sort of looks like Mickey Mouse there. We can also draw the water molecule with an oxygen in the middle and 2 hydrogens joined by straight lines. We'll call that a structural formula. Again, just like atoms, molecules such as an individual water molecule are way too small to see, but we draw them like this to keep track of the atoms and their chemical bonds. We'll define a chemical bond as an attraction between 2 atoms that joins them, whereby they form a molecule or a compound. How do we form chemical bonds? We're going to either transfer or share electrons between atoms or between molecules. And we're going to list 3 types of chemical bonds, and we'll look at examples of each of these. Ionic bonds, where electrons are transferred from one atom to another. Covalent bonds, where electrons are shared between 2 atoms. And hydrogen bonds, this will be a special case where we have neighboring molecules that have relatively sticky ends, and the sticky ends form an attraction between the neighboring molecules. This is a diagram meant to illustrate the formation of an ionic bond. Let's walk through the steps here. Here we see a sodium atom drawn with protons, neutrons, and electrons, and next to it we see a chlorine atom also drawn with protons, neutrons, and electrons. Na is the chemical abbreviation for sodium, Cl is the chemical abbreviation for chlorine. In step 2, sodium is going to lose an electron. It's going to transfer an electron, and that electron is going to go over and join with the chlorine atom. So we now call these ions, because an electron has an electrical charge, the sodium ion lost an electron. That's a minus 1, so it's a +1 electrical charge. The chlorine gained a -1 electron, so now the chloride ion has a -1 electrical charge. What's important here is that opposite electrical charges attract. Remember, opposites attract. The sodium has a positive charge, the chloride has a negative charge. Those two will be attracted or drawn together, that's the formation of an ionic bond, and they'll form a very tight sort of cube-shaped or square crystalline structure, sodium chloride. You may also recognize sodium chloride as table salt. A covalent bond will be the sharing of electrons. In these drawings, we see two hydrogen atoms joined together, and they're sharing a pair of electrons between them right there in the middle. Here we see a carbon and two oxygens. They join together. The carbons and oxygens are also sharing electrons in between them. And these bonds formed from shared electrons, we call these covalent bonds. This is now a hydrogen molecule, two hydrogens joined together. This is a carbon dioxide molecule, one carbon and two oxygens joined together. These covalent bonds can be single, double, or triple bonds, and those are indicated in the structure by a single straight line for a single bond, double straight lines for double covalent bonds, and three straight lines for a triple covalent bond. The next question we'll ask about sharing of electrons, we'll ask, are the electrons shared evenly? Here are two hydrogens, and what we're looking at with the yellow cloud of electrons, sort of the double egg shape there, is that the electrons are shared relatively evenly. They spend about equal amounts of time circling around or orbiting around both hydrogen atoms. We'll call that a nonpolar covalent bond. In the case of an oxygen and a hydrogen, however, there is a covalent bond, but notice that the yellow area, the region where the electrons hang out, is unevenly distributed. And the electrons, in fact, spend more time, there's more yellow over here at the oxygen end of this bond. The uneven sharing of electrons results in the oxygen end of the bond being slightly negatively charged. That's the lowercase Greek delta, indicating a partial negative charge. The hydrogen end of the bond, as a result, is a partial positive charge at this end. So these are even or nonpolar covalent bonds compared to uneven or polar covalent bonds. Nonpolar covalent bonds will happen whenever we have two of the same atom, such as two hydrogens or two oxygens bonded together. We'll also get these between carbons and hydrogens. Equal sharing of electrons across several bonds in a molecule gives us a nonpolar molecule. Nonpolar molecules tend to be hydrophobic, which means water-fearing, and these materials will tend not to dissolve very easily or very well in water. Examples are oxygen, methane, and most fats and oils. There's the old saying, oil and water don't mix. Oil is a nonpolar molecule with mostly nonpolar covalent bonds, and as such it does not dissolve or mix well with water. On the other hand, polar covalent bonds formed from the uneven sharing of molecules will produce polar molecules. In a polar molecule, one atom, usually the oxygen end or a nitrogen end of the molecule, hogs the electrons, and it produces a molecule with partial charges or sticky ends. In this case, the water molecule has slightly negative charges here on the oxygen end of the molecule, and then slightly positive charges on the hydrogen ends. Polar molecules tend to be hydrophilic, meaning water-loving. They mix or dissolve very easily in water. This is true of ions as well. Things that mix or dissolve easily in water are sugars, salts, amino acids, and alcohols. And of course, water itself, shown here, is a polar molecule. Water does mix well with water. If we have multiple polar molecules with their partial positive and negative charges, we'll form hydrogen bonds. And in this case, we have a water molecule shown here on the left with its partial positive and negative charges. This is a polar molecule, and water molecules will form hydrogen bonds with other water molecules, and that's symbolized by the dashed line here between the two water molecules. This is a weak attraction between the sticky ends of adjacent water molecules. Notice that the oxygen end of one water molecule always points towards the hydrogen end of a neighboring water molecule. In the big picture of chemical reactions, chemical bonds don't stay the same. We can break, form, or rearrange chemical bonds. So we can create new combinations of atoms through chemical reactions. We'll define our basic types of reactions as synthesis or anabolic, which produce new bonds, decomposition or catabolic, which break old chemical bonds, and exchange or rearrangement reactions, which rearrange existing chemical bonds. Chemical reactions in general will start with reactants. Those are the starting ingredients, and they will end with products. Those are the end products or the finishing steps of the chemical reaction. Here in part B, we see an anabolic or synthesis reaction. We're taking smaller pieces, in this case amino acids, we're forming new bonds to join the amino acids together into a larger molecule. Synthesis means putting together. Anabolic is roughly synonymous with synthesis, so we're putting together a larger something. Notice that a synthesis reaction usually requires an input of energy, requires an energy investment. Catabolic reactions, on the other hand, is where we start with a large piece and we break it down into smaller pieces. We see this with starting with glycogen, breaking glycogen down into smaller pieces of glucose molecules. Catabolic or decomposition reactions usually release energy, so we have both the forming or breaking of chemical bonds happening with our chemical reactions and also inputs and releases of energy.